What would you do if you suddenly had to offer your virginity in exchange for a life-saving surgery? That's exactly what happened to a young woman who until then believed she had an ordinary life, full of dreams and hopes. A routine visit to the doctor ended up becoming the beginning of an unexpected journey. She entered the office believing she would leave with a simple prescription, but instead left with a burden no one is ever prepared to carry. The doctor, with a serious gaze and a firm voice, explained that the tests revealed a rare and aggressive disease, so uncommon that not even statistics could fully grasp its severity. The floor disappeared beneath her feet, and suddenly the walls of the room seemed to close in on her. It was as if time had stopped, and every word echoed in slow motion, difficult to comprehend. She tried to follow every detail, but could only hear one phrase: without intervention, the outcome will be inevitable. At that moment, life's simplest memories flooded her mind. Laughter with friends, the smell of freshly brewed coffee in her mother's kitchen, the plans she'd made for the coming years. Everything seemed to crumble in seconds. The diagnosis wasn't just a medical sentence. It was a cruel invitation to face the fragility of existence. When she left the doctor's office, she didn't know whether to cry for the pain of the present or for the future that might never exist. And as if the news weren't enough, the doctor explained that there was only one chance: an experimental surgery. A procedure so complex and innovative that only a few specialists in the world were capable of performing it. Hope was there, but distant, like a star in the sky you can see but never reach. The young woman felt a mixture of hope and despair in her chest, knowing that this thread of life was accompanied by an almost insurmountable barrier. The cost of the procedure was surreal, inaccessible to the average person. The figures were so high they seemed straight out of a science fiction film. With each number revealed, her heart pounded, as if trying to keep up with the speed of reality crushing her. There was no health insurance, no government assistance, nothing that could ease the weight of that impossible price tag. It was like standing before a locked door, the key forever thrown to the bottom of the ocean. At home, alone, she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize her reflection. Her eyes were different, as if they carried a history that had changed in just one day. People still saw her as a healthy young woman, but inside, the battle had already begun. Every heartbeat reminded her that time was running out. And the question echoed in her mind: how far would someone be willing to go to survive? It was in this abyss of emotion that a dark, painful, and almost unthinkable idea germinated. An idea that arose not from ambition, but from the sheer necessity of life. Because when everything is at stake, even the most untouchable values can become currency. And in the heart of that young woman, a plan was born that would change not only her life, but also that of the doctor who, unbeknownst to her, would soon become part of this story. Days after her diagnosis, she locked herself in her room, trying to think of solutions, while the world outside continued as normal. Friends talked about parties, work, travel. But for her, none of it made sense anymore. The clock seemed to mock her, ticking away every second as if it were a cruel reminder that her life was slipping away. She tried to think of alternatives, asking family members for help, setting up an online fundraiser, taking out loans. But she soon realized that all of this was like throwing buckets of water on a raging fire. The cost of the surgery was so unaffordable that it made any conventional attempt merely an illusion. It was like running toward an unbreakable wall. With each idea discarded, the feeling of helplessness grew, suffocating her more and more. Amidst this turmoil, the young woman realized something that sent shivers down her spine. There was nothing material in her life that had enough value to save her very existence. Except for something she had always considered untouchable: her virginity, so jealously guarded, a symbol of her intimacy and innocence, now emerged in her mind as the only currency she could possibly possess. A cruel, almost absurd idea, but one that began to occupy her thoughts like an insistent whisper. She fought the thought. She tried to push it away like a shadow in the night. But the more time passed, the clearer the reality became. Either she found a way to pay for the surgery, or she simply gave up on life. And giving up wasn't an option. The survival instinct, the same one that turns ordinary people into heroes in the face of danger, screamed within her louder than any moral values. The decision was born silently, amidst tears and sleepless nights. She began to discreetly research, figuring out how she could turn that idea into something real. There was no glamour, no hint of romance in her choice, It was just desperation, raw and pure. A desperation that made her wonder how far a human being can go when all they want is to keep breathing. In the following days, she began to observe people differently. With each look, she wondered if anyone would be able to understand her pain or if they would simply judge her. The fear of social judgment was enormous, but still less than the fear of death. Between living condemned or living marked by her choice, she knew which path she would choose, even if it meant carrying an invisible scar for the rest of her life. And so, faced with the inevitable, she decided to take the step that would change everything. She would seek out a renowned surgeon, someone who had not only the expertise to perform the procedure, but also the power to decide whether her proposal would be accepted. Deep down, she didn't know if she was about to save her life or destroy everything she believed about herself. But one thing was certain. There was no turning back. He was known by everyone in the industry as a cold genius, someone whose hands seemed to defy anatomy itself. When the young woman heard about him, his name was accompanied by whispers, technical miracles, surgical decisions made with surgical precision, and a distant manner that was disturbing. There were no photographs of mercy. There were accounts of patients saved and faces marked by silent reverence. His reputation was built on results and reports, not on smiles or hugs in the hospital hallway. For many, seeking out that surgeon meant accepting not only science, but also the coldness of those who place technique above human warmth. She, however, did not have the luxury of choosing a character. She only needed to find someone capable of achieving the impossible, and so, he decided that, despite his fear, he would knock on the door of that office without letting himself be put off by the imposing aura that surrounded him. Upon arriving at the hospital, the waiting room seemed to hold a tacit reverence for its name. Staff whispered respectfully, patients looked on with hope and a little fear. When he finally entered the hallway that led to the office, he felt his own heart hammer as if asking for permission to continue. The office was minimalist, as if only reason and medical facts were there. When the surgeon entered, he maintained his usual rigid posture, assessing the young woman with a look that carried more weight than words. She realized that no drama there seemed to convince. Only the clarity of the data and the raw sincerity of the requests could touch that man. And at that first glance, he sensed that convincing would be a difficult process, but not impossible. He listened to the story with the clinical attention he always had, asking precise and straightforward questions. There was no initial judgment, just a measured examination of her situation and the limits of medicine. When he spoke, his voice didn't waver, and each sentence seemed to break the problem down into measurable parts. At the mention of the experimental surgery, his eyes narrowed not out of cruelty, but out of technical curiosity. He was driven by scientific challenges, by cases that tested the edges of knowledge and forced him to innovate. Still, the distant expression remained, a sign of a professional who protects his private life with the same firmness with which he executes a scalpel. She left the meeting with a mixture of relief and apprehension, knowing that he was perhaps the only safe bridge to her salvation. In the days that followed, the young woman studied everything about the surgeon, published articles, conferences, interviews. He discovered a man who was proud of his work and afraid of what fame could do to his practice. There were stories of patients who idolized him and others of relatives who complained about the coldness of his methods. But he also found reports of hidden empathy, discreet gestures, and nights when he didn't sleep because of a recently operated patient. This contradiction left her in a state of vigilance. Perhaps the hardness was a facade to protect a heart that had already suffered too much. She realized that to touch someone like that, emotional appeals wouldn't be enough. She would need to show courage and clarity. And then he decided to prepare himself for the meeting that would decide his fate, polishing every word he dared to utter. When he finally made the decisive appointment, he felt the weight of all the possible scenarios. He imagined cold refusals, hopeless clinical advice, and also who knows a knot of understanding. Even so, he took a deep breath and entered the office like a person who had decided to no longer run away from his own story. He received her without surprise, as if he had already expected someone to arrive with an impossible case for him. There was a silence that lasted just long enough for both of them to measure the distances between them. She spoke candidly about her diagnosis, the necessary surgery, and the financial barrier that stood between her and life. And in that silence between the lines, the surgeon observed more than he listened. He assessed intention, strength and risk. He asked technical questions, evaluated exams and, above all, asked her to talk about what motivated her to make such a radical decision. Curing her, something in his expression changed not dramatically, but enough that she sensed a retreat in the walls surrounding him. It wasn't theatrical compassion, it was professional interest tempered by a human curiosity that was rarely admitted aloud. He didn't promise anything, but made it clear that he would analyze the scientific and ethical viability of the case. For her, this was already a breath of fresh air in the midst of suffocation, not an answer, but a door that had been left ajar. As she left, she felt she had planted a seed of truth. Perhaps his professionalism would blossom into something unexpected. And as he walked outside, he knew the next step would be the negotiation that could decide everything. The silence in that room seemed greater than any words that could be spoken. The young woman, her hands trembling, took a deep breath before opening her heart. There was no sugarcoating what would come next. She explained that she had no resources, no family capable of helping her, no time to even hope for miracles. But I had something I still held on to as a last resort. That confession came out choked, as if wrenched from her, and hung in the air between them, charged with vulnerability. The surgeon watched her silently, his eyes steady, almost expressionless, but attentive to every detail. The proposal seemed too absurd to be taken seriously, offering his virginity in exchange for surgery. He didn't interrupt, didn't show immediate surprise, simply letting her complete the confession. The weight of her courage didn't go unnoticed, though his demeanor remained cold. Deep inside, he sought to rationalize the absurdity of a situation that placed him between medicine and the unexpected. The young woman felt her heart racing, as if every second were a judgment. She expected a violent reaction, perhaps a harsh rebuke, or even expulsion. But none of that happened. His silence was the hardest sentence to bear. Each tick of the clock seemed to amplify the feeling of being stripped of not only her innermost worth, but also all her dignity. Still, she stood firm, because her life depended on that boldness. He then leaned against the table and spoke for the first time since the revelation. His voice was firm, but not cruel. He asked if she realized the gravity of what she was proposing, if she understood the implications it could have for both of them. It wasn't a moralistic lecture, but an almost clinical question, as if he were analyzing an unusual symptom. With each answer, the doctor saw less desperation and more determination. And this determination intrigued him more than the proposal itself. The atmosphere in the room was tense, but not hostile. There was something about the way she stood erect, even through her tears, that conveyed more strength than weakness. The doctor realized that before him was not just a desperate patient, but someone willing to cross any line to survive. This realization began to gradually dismantle the armor he had worn against any emotional appeal. For the first time, the distance between the doctor and the woman seemed to diminish. She insisted she wasn't seeking pity or favors, just a chance. Her voice, even choked, carried a tone of truth impossible to ignore. It was a cry for life, raw and direct. The doctor, silently, reflected on the extent of his responsibility, not only as a professional, but as a human being. In that moment, he understood that the negotiation wasn't about exchanging bodies or values, but about how far someone can go when faced with the limit between life and death. And when he finally sighed, letting go of the weight of that moment, she realized an answer was about to come. She didn't know if it would be a sentence of denial or the beginning of an unexpected twist. But something in his eyes told her the impact had already been made, and that from then on, nothing in this story would follow the conventional path. When the silence was finally broken, there was no scandal or revulsion. The surgeon, with a firm look, said he would not accept the proposal on the terms she had presented. The young woman felt her heart drop, as if she had lost her last chance. But before despair could engulf her, he added, he would perform the surgery, yes, but not for what she had to offer. He would do it because, for the first time in years, he had found a patient who would not be defeated by the impossible. She didn't understand right away. Her body, tense, awaited explanations. The doctor then explained that her proposal shocked him not because of its indecency, but because of its courage. No one had ever dared to expose themselves so much before him. And this boldness revealed a desire to live so intense that it inspired him more than any amount of money. In that moment, the cold logic of medicine opened to something he rarely admitted: compassion. The agreement that emerged there wasn't written on ordinary paper. There were no values, no physical exchanges, there was only a silent pact of trust. The doctor would assume the risks of an experimental procedure, knowing that each decision could change the course of her life. And she, in turn, entrusted to him not only the body to be treated, but also the absolute trust that this gesture was born of an act of humanity, not business. When the day of the surgery arrived, the hospital seemed to breathe in time with the young woman's tension. She entered the operating room with suppressed tears, but certain that she had survived until that moment because of an unexpected choice. The surgeon, focused, prepared his team with the precision of someone commanding an army in battle. There was no room for error, no margin for distractions. Her future was in his hands. The procedure began, and time seemed to blur. Hours passed like minutes, each movement calculated to the limit. The team watched in silence, as if witnessing an invisible duel between life and death. The doctor, despite his usual coldness, felt something different. This wasn't just another experimental surgery. It was the responsibility of honoring the trust of someone who had bet everything on him. And this made him operate as if his own life were at stake. Outside, the clock ticked slowly for those awaiting news. For the anesthetized young woman, each heartbeat was an unconscious reminder that there was still hope. For the doctor, each technical decision was accompanied by a rare emotion, the feeling that he was restoring more than just health. Somehow, he was restoring meaning to himself, rediscovering the essence of why he had chosen medicine. When the surgery was over, the silence was broken by the announcement that the procedure had been a success. For the first time in a long time, the doctor allowed himself to take a deep breath and release the weight he was carrying. He knew the story wouldn't end there, because, more than healing a body, a silent bond had been forged that would change the course of both their lives. The first few days after surgery were a mixture of pain and hope. The young woman woke slowly, her body heavy and her mind confused, but each breath was proof that she was still here. The hospital corridors, once frightening, now seemed like silent witnesses to a rebirth. The medical team closely monitored every sign of progress, but it was the surgeon's watchful gaze that surprised her most. He, who had previously seemed distant, now appeared at the bedside in silence, as if overseeing not just her physical recovery, but something deeper. She realized his presence wasn't formal. He wasn't there just to check tests or sign reports. There was a discreet care in every gesture, a concern that didn't fit the cold image everyone portrayed. For the first time, she saw in him not just the renowned doctor, but the man who had chosen to risk his life. This awakened an unexpected feeling in her, gratitude bordering on admiration, as if each visit were a reminder that it was still worth believing. Their conversations began tentatively, breaking the seemingly unbreakable ice. Between medical reports and questions about his recovery, small personal stories emerged. He spoke of sleepless nights, patients who had shaped his career, and even mistakes that had made him doubt himself. She, in turn, shared fears, interrupted dreams, and even shy laughter, as if discovering she could feel lightness again. Their relationship began to transform, forged by experiences of pain and courage. The doctor, who for years had shielded himself from emotional attachments, felt disarmed before her. It wasn't just the patient who had risked everything to survive. She was someone whose vulnerability reminded him of the original reason he had chosen medicine. He was beginning to see that behind each clinical case, a unique story, a heart beating with dreams and fears. And this realization rekindled within him a flame he thought had been extinguished. For her, each day of recovery was also a reunion with herself. Her body, still fragile, bore scars, but her spirit seemed stronger than ever. His visits became part of her routine, and with them came a sense of security she had never felt before. It was as if she had found someone who understood her pain without needing many words. An unlikely friendship was born there, built on the tenderness of a second chance. Their eyes began to convey what words hesitated to reveal. It wasn't romance, it wasn't a promise, it was something more subtle: respect. He admired her for her courage in facing the impossible, and she respected him for choosing compassion over absolute coldness. This invisible exchange between them transformed each encounter into something they both came to look forward to, even without admitting it. In the silence of their visits, in the brief exchanges of smiles, a true connection grew. And as the recovery progressed, it became clear that the surgery had done more than save a life. It had also revealed unexpected paths for both of them. For her, the chance to rewrite her story. For him, the opportunity to rediscover the lost essence of his profession. But the outcome of this transformation still awaited the next step, when the weight of what had been experienced would reveal its true meaning. Over time, the young woman returned to walking the hospital corridors, stronger with each passing day. The scars still marred her skin, but they were symbols of victory, not weakness. She felt she had gained more than health. She had gained a new perspective on life. Small gestures, like taking a deep breath, feeling the sun on her face, or hearing a loved one's laughter, now held incomparable value. Everything seemed different, as if the world had taken on new colors after the darkness. The doctor, for his part, observed this transformation from afar. He, who always hid behind professional coldness, could not deny the impact that patient had made on his life. He discovered that saving lives wasn't just about mastering techniques or pushing scientific boundaries. It was also about being touched by the stories, pain, and dreams of those who came to him seeking hope. The young woman had broken down the wall he had built around himself. Between them, a silent bond remained, marked by respect and gratitude. There were no debts, no impossible promises. Only the certainty that, at some point, their paths had crossed to transform each other. She found a chance to live, and he rediscovered the purpose forgotten amidst the routine. This invisible but powerful exchange was greater than any contract or proposal that could ever have existed. Her life went on, full of new plans and new beginnings, and with each step, she carried the reminder that courage can be born precisely in the darkest moments. He, in turn, returned to the operating room with a different outlook. Now, each patient who arrived was not just a clinical case, but a universe of stories that deserved to be heard. The young woman had left him an invisible legacy, one that manifested itself in every choice, in every medical decision. Their reunion, outside the hospital setting, was simple: a quick coffee, an unpretentious conversation. But in that moment, they both understood they were no longer just doctor and patient. They were two survivors of different battles, united by the experience that had changed their lives. Their respect and friendship remained, discreet but unshakable. For her, the story didn't end with a cure. It ended with the realization that life demands tough choices, but also shows that there's always a glimmer of hope. For him, it didn't end with hospital discharge, but with the reminder that his profession could be more humane than he imagined. Healing, after all, wasn't just about scalpels and medication, but about the ability to look at someone and see beyond the illness. And so, between scars and new beginnings, they both moved forward, marked by an experience that could not be erased. A story that began with despair and ended as a powerful reminder. True life arises when you have the courage to face the impossible and when someone has the audacity to believe that it's still worth fighting for. And if you liked this story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to our channel.